So what is the best Greek New Testament if you're just starting out? You're just looking for your first Greek text. What should you choose? In this video, I'm going to give you the ultimate guide to select a Greek New Testament if you're a pretty new person to Biblical Greek. So let's get into it. Hi, I'm Daryl Burling from Biblical Mastery Academy. I help people like you master the tools, habits, and systems to learn to read and study the New Testament in the original language, which is Greek. So if you're interested in doing that, well, you're in the right place. And in this video, we're going to talk about the best way to select a Greek New Testament, assuming you're starting with near no knowledge whatsoever. And this may apply to those of you who are a little further on as well. And certainly there are some lessons that I've learned along the way, even when I was sort of a little bit earlier, like just finishing beginning Greek and those kinds of things that I wish I'd known back then that I know now that I'm going to pass on in this video as well. Now, I've also written all of this up into a handy guide with a pretty reasonable explanation, which you can download for free at my website at bma.to/GNT guide. So GNT guide, Greek New Testament guide, you'll find it if you go looking that up. Right, so let's talk about a couple little starter points that are worth noting as we get started. First of all, the questions you're used to asking for finding a translation of the New Testament in English are going to be kind of different to the questions you're going to be asking when it comes to selecting a Greek New Testament. One of the really common questions that people ask when they select a English translation is, which is the most accurate translation? This question is not really, strictly speaking, applicable to the selecting a Greek New Testament. Let me explain why. To start with, when you ask this question of a translation, you're really asking the question about the translation philosophy behind that translation. How have they understood the Greek text from which they're translated into English, and how have they tried to portray the original Greek into English? Because there are a number of ways of doing that. Have they tried, for instance, to render the Greek text as literally as possible in English? Or have they tried to make a really readable English translation and not worried so much about sticking to the exact wording that the Greek text uses? Those are two very different translation philosophies which will produce two very different translations. And so asking which is the most accurate translation depends on how you understand those two camps and other camps that sit in between those as well. Should you have a word-for-word translation, or should you have a translation that is more generally representative of what the text says but easier to read? Well, it really depends on what your goals are. And so that question doesn't really apply in the same way to a Greek text that it does to a translation for obvious reasons. The Greek text is not a translation, and therefore no translation philosophy applies. However, that doesn't mean to say there are no philosophical concerns to take into account when you look at a Greek text. But the biggest problem that we have that requires a philosophical solution when it comes to looking at Greek texts is that we actually don't have the original manuscripts. Now, if you remember, Paul and Peter and John and Jude and James and so on, they all wrote texts with their own hand, or an amanuensis, somebody who wrote it for them at their dictation. And that text is regarded as inspired. The doctrine of inspiration applies only to that original text, and we no longer have any of those texts available. But what we do have is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the wild number of copies of all of those Greek texts. And that means then that we need to ask, well, which of these Greek texts best represent the original manuscript? Because all of these copies have been, up until about the 1500s, copied by hand. And of course, when you copy something by hand, if you've ever tried to copy a page of text, you will know what I mean. It's actually really hard because you've got to be very focused, you've got to concentrate, and there's all sorts of little errors that you can make along the way, which I'll detail in downloads you can grab down below. But the point here is that those texts have all got variants in them. That is, that they might have one thing in the text they were copying from, and they accidentally wrote something else in the copy they were creating. And these are called variants. And we have lots of variants. Now, the nice thing about having so many copies is that we can see when these variants come about. But this raises the question of, well, how do we understand, how do we go back and work out which is the most likely to represent that original manuscript? And there are two schools of thoughts, broadly speaking, and each of these two schools of thoughts actually has a variety of subpositions within them. So we're not going to deal with all those subdivisions and positions that people have in there. But the point is that there are two positions, and the first one is what I'm going to call kind of an eclectic kind of approach. And that generally means that they're going to draw from a variety of different texts that are around from North Egypt to Palestine to all sorts of other areas. And they're going to draw on those texts, and normally they're going to tend towards selecting earlier texts over later ones, because in theory, the earlier the text is, the more likely it is to be similar to what was originally written. Not that the earliest text is going to be the primary, the way that eclectic scholars, as they call them, are going to be looking at these texts, but nonetheless, there's a tendency within this group to choose the earlier texts. The other group we're looking at is what we call the majority position, or the Byzantine text type position. And this is an argument really that the majority of the text should really be what we aim to work with. And there's a number of nuances within each of these different positions. So the point is that one of these, the Byzantine text type, is argued by some to be a later text type and therefore not as early and therefore not as reliable and so on. Now, I don't think this is a really straightforward discussion. And my argument at this point for you, if you're brand new to this whole discussion, is if you're being confused about which Greek New Testament you should purchase on the basis of this question, you should probably just put this question aside and focus on more important things that are going to drive your decision in the meantime. It's far more important that you think about selecting and learning the language than it is about struggling with which one should I choose from a text critical point of view. The reality is that in 94% of cases where there are variants, the majority position, the Byzantine text type and the eclectic text type actually end up selecting the same variants anyway, and so the actual amount of differences is not that great. There are some significant differences, but again, for where you're at, starting point, unless you have a really strong reason to go for one or the other, or you've got the time to invest to evaluate the different positions, this is probably not a discussion you need to worry about right now. And beyond this, the distinction between these two positions is so little that you're going to see far more agreement than you're going to see disagreement generally anyway. And the disagreement you'll see between the ways these are translated is significantly greater than the difference between the actual Greek texts that sit underneath it, regardless of which of these two camps you're going to look at the text from. And of course, you can purchase from both camps if you want to. So my recommendation is that probably focusing on Byzantine text types versus eclectic text types is probably not where you want to focus for the moment. There are a couple of more practical considerations to consider, and that is really more about the format of the Greek text that you're looking to purchase. And this is really where it comes back to you and what you're trying to achieve with your own personal goals for the Greek text. Let me break down the different formats that we find, in common formats at least, for Greek New Testaments around today. The first is interlinear Greek text. And in interlinear Greek text, there's a number of different formats for this. There's interlinears, there's reverse interlinears, there's texts that have an English word, then a Greek word, and in brackets, for instance. There's all sorts of different variations on this. But effectively, the idea of an interlinear is that you have an English text, and generally you have a parallel line with a Greek text underneath it. Now, it could be the other way around with the Greek on top and the English underneath. It just depends on the edition you are looking at. Some of these interlinears include additional information underneath the line, such as the lexical form, perhaps the original text you might find to look it up in a lexicon or a dictionary. Some of them might have information about how to decline a noun or pass a verb, and if you don't know what that means, you probably don't need that information. And so there are some variants about how these are presented. And again, what you're looking for is going to be the key here. Should you use an interlinear Greek New Testament? My personal recommendation is if you're really not intending to learn to read Greek and you just want to feel good about having a Greek text in front of you from which you can go look up words, then an interlinear Greek New Testament is probably going to be all you need. However, if you have an aspiration to actually be able to work with the text of the New Testament in the original language, you probably want to skip past an interlinear and move to one of the later formats that we're about to talk about. Which brings us to the second kind of Greek New Testament, which is Reader's Editions. Now, Reader's Editions normally provide you with the Greek text at the top of the page, and for words that occur in an infrequent number, such as normally it's less than 50 times in the Greek New Testament. Sometimes it's a little bit different, maybe less than 30 times. But if you find those less frequent words, you will find a number in superscript next to the Greek word in the text. And then at the bottom of the page, you'll find a corresponding entry for that number, and next to that will be the lexical form for the Greek word. And in some cases, it'll also provide you with that parsing information, so you can look at that and see, oh, it says it's a verb in the aorist, active, indicative, third person singular, whatever it happens to be. And you can instantly see from the lexical form and the parsing information what this form in the actual text is, which will help you to translate it as you're reading through the text. The difference between an interlinear Greek New Testament and a Reader's Edition Greek New Testament, from the point of view of what it calls you to do, is there's a lot more demand on you as a reader when you get to a Reader's Edition. You need to know how the language works. You really need to have been through first year Greek in a seminary, or finished the beginning Greek course with Biblical Mastery Academy or somewhere else, to be able to really use a Reader's Edition. It also requires that you've learned the 330 words or perhaps 600 words that occur 50 or 30 times or more in the Greek New Testament. Now, if you've done that and you've got a good handle on those words, then a Reader's Edition is going to serve you well for where you are right now. However, again, it comes back to what your goals are. If your goal, or if you go to seminary, say, and you're just happy to work with whatever seminary gives you, they're not going to teach you to read the Greek New Testament or encourage you to do so. They're going to teach you to do exegesis generally. And a Reader's Edition, if that's all you're going to do, is probably going to be sufficient for you to work through a Greek text before you go and do that study. But again, if you're interested in actually reading the Greek New Testament fully as you'd read any other text, albeit maybe slower or with a little bit more help here and there, then a Reader's Edition is probably not where you want to stop. For myself, my experience when I was going through seminary, I bought a number of Greek New Testaments that were Reader's Editions. One of them I spent over $200 getting rebound in this beautiful leather cover, and today it sits on a shelf because I don't use Reader's Editions anymore, because frankly I just don't need them. And so that might be your experience too. If your goal is to be able to read the New Testament in the original language, then you're probably not going to be able to use a Reader's Edition for very long. However, as you go through that process, it can be helpful to pick it up, read text ahead of where you are, or things like that, and just sort of give yourself a little bit more experience. So I generally wouldn't recommend buying a Reader's Edition if your goal is to read every word in the Greek New Testament fluently. However, if you've got the money and you're willing to spend money twice on a Greek New Testament, a Reader's Edition can be a really good starting point, and then buy a fuller Greek New Testament for perhaps a little bit further down the track. The other thing with a Reader's Edition is that because it provides so many words for you, it does disincentivize you from actually going further, which is one of the reasons why I recommend not necessarily going and buying one if you actually need to use it earlier on. You're better off actually allowing yourself the incentive to go learn more words, and if you don't know the words, then use another tool that's going to help you to look those up, maybe a lexicon or something that's going to provide those words fairly easily for you, rather than actually just looking them up at the bottom of the page. I think the key thing here is you want to incentivize yourself to complete what you want to get to, rather than disincentivize yourself from actually getting there. And I think a Reader's Edition runs the risk of disincentivizing you from actually learning the vocabulary, which then puts at risk the whole enterprise of learning to read and study the New Testament. It's easy to get lazy. It's very difficult to challenge yourself on a continual basis to keep moving forward, which is exactly what you want to do. Keep taking small, consistent steps toward mastery. Speaking of mastery, that brings us to the critical texts, and also to what I call offhandedly reader-oriented Greek texts. Now, again, there are a variety of choices here, and we're kind of spoiled for choice today, but there are full text editions of eclectic texts such as the Nestle Aland or UBS text, or the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, which is my personal favorite, or the Byzantine text group as well. There's a number of different editions of the Robinson Pierpont, or whatever it is, different editions around, and there's a lot of different options here. The big question here that you need to ask yourself is, do you want to know about all those variants, or do you want an experience where you're able just to sit down and read the text largely without being interrupted by those variant discussions? Now, if you want all the variants, and that's fine, then you want to get a critical edition, which is where the Nestle Aland 27th edition or 28th edition and the UBS 4 or 5 is going to come in handy. The Nestle Aland provides you with a pretty comprehensive list of all of different variants that you're going to come across. Not all of them, but it's a good significant number of them. And the UBS provides you with much the same information, but where there are significant variants, they actually provide you with a degree of certainty with a lettering system, A, B, C, or D. A is certain, D is very uncertain about how certain they are about whether this word or this reading in the Greek text matches the original text. So those are the two critical editions. The other two worth looking at, in my opinion, the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, which is a text that is very well built for reading for a number of reasons. One, it gets all that apparatus material out of your way. You still get a very brief apparatus at the bottom of pages where there is a significant variant. However, for the most part, it gets out of the way. More importantly, if you're buying a physical product, you get a really nice, beautiful reading experience relative to what you get in those critical editions. The critical editions have, in my opinion, a rather horrible font, a rather horrible paper, and covers which I don't really care for. On the Tyndale House Greek New Testament, you get a really nice font, you get a nicely thought through layout, you get good paper, and you've got a choice of different bindings, which makes it an easy no-brainer from my position. The other one you can look at is the Byzantine text types, and there are a number of editions going on there, including some third-party, because it's all in the public domain, there are people making their own editions of this and having them printed as well. So have a look around if you're interested in something from that group. So it really comes down to this question: where are you going in your journey with Greek? Because if you're going to be learning to read every text in the New Testament, then you want to have a process for doing that. And that's where buying one of these comprehensive Greek New Testament, which is a proper Greek New Testament, is a great aspirational purchase. It's going to put forward for you this outcome that you can then aim for, and then it's going to drive you to aim there and get there. And if I may, one of the things we do in the Biblical Mastery Academy Greek Mastery membership is actually teach you from the very beginning how the language works, how to read the text, and then book by book, you'll learn how to read a full Greek New Testament without having to look any words up whatsoever. It's designed to get you independently free of all of those helps, like a reader's edition, certainly an interlinear, and even lexicons to a large extent, and be able to just pick up a Greek text and read it like you would a regular book. Certainly there's going to be struggles along the way. Your knowledge and memory of different Greek forms is going to grow as you start to read. But nonetheless, the goal that we have for you, if you're interested in that, is actually to be able to read the Greek New Testament. And what we do is we get you in the easy books to start with, and we get you to learn all the words, and you can work through the syntax. It's easier syntax in those earlier books, and then add book after book after book, and never get you to learn the same word twice, so that by the time you work your way through our program, you're able to read the entire Greek New Testament book by book. So if you're interested in that, go to bma.to/get started to find out more about the process. Otherwise, don't forget to download your free guide to getting a Greek New Testament below at bma.to/GNT guide. If you did get this far in the video, give me an emoji with a face with tears of joy on it. I'd love to see that in the comment section below. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. We'll see you there.